This video covers part 2 of chapter 5, Legal and Forensic Psychology for PSY 120, Careers in Psychology, Neuroscience, and Human Development. In this section of the chapter, we're going to take a look at graduate opportunities, where after your bachelor's degree, you pursue additional education either at the master's or the doctoral level. At the graduate degree level, you can become a person who is able to, based on licensure and education, to do what are called forensic assessments, and also to provide services to offenders and to supervise others who provide direct services, either in a corrections environment or out in the community. You may also find yourself in a position of assisting law enforcement officers, although that is typically not in the way it is presented in popular culture, particularly movies and television, where police forces seem to magically have at their beck and call a psychiatrist who can provide them with really magical profiles of offenders that they're looking for. That's just really not a thing. In some cases, people who have interests in this area are researchers who are studying the legal system itself. Some are involved directly in the legal system by providing consulting services for trials. So what you might do if you're doing trial consulting is to assist lawyers, assist counsel in selecting juries, in designing jury questionnaires and things like that. Others may be conducting research that helps to inform what kind of policies are necessary, what kind of policies are impactful. And for still others, it's basic research on causes and consequences of criminality within a particular culture. Psychologists in any discipline may be interested in intersections between psychology and law. For example, I'm a social psychologist and I have interests in this area, primarily having to do with the attitudes, beliefs, and values that people have about the nature of the legal system. So you can be in any of the areas of psychology and run into questions that you can answer as a psychologist, as a researcher, with those interests at the graduate level. There are also many, I wouldn't say it's very, very, very common, but there have been many people who are professionally trained as psychologists who work in the area of politics. In some cases, these are elected officials, but for many, they are working in the public policy realm. Either directly as employees of the state or even the federal government, or in private practice in consulting. So let's take a look at some of the more specific graduate level opportunities for people. One is in an area that's now called correctional psychology. So these are individuals who typically at the master's level have clinical or counseling degrees and then licensure, maybe as an LPC or an LPCC, and they're going to work with people who have broken the law to reduce the likelihood of recidivism and reincarceration, to work on mental health problems that are challenging to that particular person. So for example, let's say that you have a person who has been convicted of a drug offense, maybe selling small amounts of heroin, for example, but also has a substance use disorder. Maybe they have an addiction. They may also have other mental health diagnoses, maybe anxiety issues or depression. So the master's degree correctional psychologist is going to work with that offender to treat their substance use disorder as well as their other mental health problems. The assumption is, without dealing with those symptoms, without dealing with those issues, that person is going to go back out into the world after serving their sentence and have those problems still in existence, which increases the likelihood of repeat offending. Same goes for doctoral degree holders. The difference is that in addition to directly providing clinical and counseling services, They also are more likely to be involved in supervision of the master's degree holding clinical and counseling workers. So they may have more managerial responsibilities and more responsibilities for assessments and report writing. At the graduate level, and I mentioned this in the previous presentation, forensic examiners in many cases have graduate degrees that help them to perform that task of forensic evaluation. So for example, in criminal cases, you may have the prosecution or the defense ask for a formal examination of the person's mental state. In some cases, the people who do this work identify themselves as forensic examiners. In other cases, they identify themselves as forensic psychologists. It's just a variation in their labeling of their specialization. So you may have an examiner who comes in not for the purpose, like at the bachelor's level position for forensic examination, where primarily you're interviewing witnesses or victims. In this case, you're interviewing and producing reports about people who are charged with crimes. Or in the civil context, people whose competency to represent themselves in civil matters is somehow in question. So you may have evaluations of competency to stand trial or competency at the time of a crime. Those may be examinations in those cases. Another area within the civil realm is providing examinations for custody cases. So, for example, if you have parents who are in a dispute about custody arrangements, both sides may call for forensic examinations, interviews of children, interviews of the parents, to provide a report to the court as to that context. In other kinds of hearings, like civil commitment hearings, where there's been some kind of request either by the state or local government that a person be civilly committed because of their behavior or mental illness, the person has a right to challenge that commitment. And in some cases, the forensic examiner is going to be called in to do a mental health assessment. There are occasions in personal injury cases and other kinds of civil lawsuits where a forensic examiner may be called in to assess the mental state of the person. Many of these people work in private practice, and forensic examinations is only a part of what they do. To call themselves forensic examiners, they do need to have specific training in forensic assessment. So hence the tendency for these individuals to have graduate level training, often in forensic psychology. Now, as I mentioned before, most of people who work in forensic psychology have a degree in either clinical or counseling, with the edge toward the clinical side, because partly, but just because of history, that's where forensic psychology really took hold, was in the clinical psychology area. But that is also supported by the idea that you're more dealing with a good fit between the medical model, which is more common within the clinical psychology universe. When conducting these kinds of evaluations, what people are given and what they use in their work is broad training in the basics of psychological assessment, where you're doing personality tests, tests of intelligence, tests of cognitive functioning, tests of neuropsychological state and competency, but also specialized training in actually doing assessments about behavior. One of the more controversial areas within this sphere is trying to do assessments when courts ask psychologists to predict whether a person is going to reoffend, or more controversially even, if they're going to be dangerous in the future. Most psychologists would agree that we do not have tools that enable us to make those kinds of predictions with reliability, particularly dangerousness. So the specialized training really is really important so that people understand both what they can do and what their limitations are in the work. The training that most forensic psychologists receive comes when they are in their graduate program. So if you're really strongly interested in becoming a practicing forensic psychologist, the normative pathway is to get into a PhD clinical psychology program that specializes in forensic psychology. Part of your training in your doctoral program will put you in the context of doing the work of a forensic psychologist with actual people who are in the criminal justice system. I had friends who were in that track when I was in graduate school. As I mentioned in the previous presentation, I went to the University of Nebraska. There is a forensic track in their clinical training program. And what my friends were doing as they moved through their graduate program, especially as they approached the third and fourth years of their training programs, the clinical experience they were getting was in that criminal justice context, getting additional training in assessment and interviewing and examination, as well as being exposed to the day-to-day work of forensic psychologists. Another area that I find really interesting is police psychology. And here, this is a really interesting kind of mixture of interests that people might have. It has some of the qualities of an industrial organizational psychologist, or a personnel psychologist more accurately, who works in that sort of HR sphere of doing selection and assessing competency for particular positions, and also delivering clinical or counseling services. But in this case, it's in the context of working with police, working with law enforcement officers. In some aspects of this work involves management. It involves consulting, helping police forces, helping criminal justice agencies with officers to make good decisions about hiring, about promotion, about a variety of things, fitness for duty being one of them. There are some police organizations, I would argue most, do at least some degree of pre-employment assessment. So some people who work in this area are in private practice and they provide services to police agencies in pre-employment assessment. So doing testing, personality testing, intelligence testing, cognitive testing, in some cases neuropsychological testing, although the most common is personality testing. These individuals may also be involved in doing fitness for duty evaluations. So, for example, if a law enforcement officer has been involved in a violent altercation, maybe a shooting, an officer-involved shooting, or an incident where they were harmed, the police psychologist will become involved in order to determine whether the person is ready to go back to work. There may be work for police psychologists in doing assessments about promotion or movement of individuals within a police force to specialized units, doing specialized work. So moving to tactics teams like SWAT teams, tactical response teams, hostage negotiation, and so on. That's usually larger police departments that have those sorts of specialized units as a regular course of business. Hostage negotiation may involve a police psychologist. It may not. It typically does not. But there are individuals, particularly in larger police organizations, who have individuals who are specially trained as hostage negotiators. Some of these individuals are people with psychology degrees who consult with the police in order to engage in those kinds of negotiations. As you might imagine, these are not situations that are going to be happening every single day. So a a person who specializes in that work is largely going to be hired on a contingency basis. I mentioned this briefly before. The police psychologist may become involved when a law enforcement officer has used deadly force, when they have had to kill someone. So they may work with investigating officers in internal affairs, for example, to make sure that they have solid information about the incident, particularly in terms of the psychological aspects of that situation. Most often, the police psychologist is going to be involved in assessing fitness for duty and return to duty after events of this kind have occurred. Police psychologists may also engage in consultation. They may work with police officers who find themselves, and this is a fairly routine experience for uniformed officers, who are engaged with people in their communities who have mental illnesses. Working with those officers, police psychologists can help them get a better understanding of what the experiences are, particularly of people who are experiencing psychosis and who are in an agitated state, so that they can be safely and securely taken into custody or submitted for evaluation in care in a hospital setting. Less frequently will you see police actively involved in an investigation. Again, that is a mythology that's largely created by popular culture in crime drama, film, and television. Occasionally, police psychologists may be consulted. Occasionally, forensic psychologists may be consulted, but that's really a rare occurrence. Most police organizations don't have that kind of ready access to consultants who are psychologists or psychiatrists. Another kind of graduate degree opportunity, which is more research-based, is being a trial consultant. Many of my peers at the University of Nebraska, some of whom were trained in experimental psychology areas like social, such as me, or who were cross-trained in law, so getting a law degree and a psychology degree, either in clinical and counseling, or most commonly social psychology and cognitive psychology, can create work that involves consulting with attorneys, using their expertise and their knowledge in psychology to help attorneys do their job, particularly when they are facing going to trial, either in a criminal or a civil context. So trial consultation involves a range of activities that can involve creating jury questionnaires, conducting focus groups with mock juries, running entire mock trials, doing analysis of the case in terms of the psychological elements of the story, and assisting attorneys in selecting their juries. What kind of people are most likely to be favorable to your side? So what trial consultants often do in their work is they look at the evidence, they look at the case information, they do an analysis of that case for the attorneys that have hired them. They look at, they work with the attorneys to develop questions that they're going to use during trial. They're going to work with the attorneys on strategy for jury selection, for managing witnesses, for talking to witnesses, and for developing the story that they're going to present at trial. And this is both in the criminal and the civil context. Consultants may be involved in academic research as well, but often their research really is tied to understanding the trial process and putting that to direct use with their clients. Researchers who are on the academic side are really working in this applied space of how does the criminal justice system work from a psychological perspective? How are juries persuaded by certain kinds of information, and so on. In addition, some psychologists who work in this sphere give advice directly to attorneys, thinking about the characteristics of specific individuals and how they might behave and how they might think as jurors. While this may seem unpalatable to some people, you're supposed to be tried by a jury of your peers, not a jury that's specially selected to lean one direction or another. It is a niche area that can be highly lucrative. So, primarily you're talking about higher dollar cases, bigger profile cases. One of my peers from my graduate days was part of the trial consulting team in the O.J. Simpson case, which is really disturbing to think about. But there you have it. So it's an interesting area. It is a relatively small niche. So if it's something that interests you, do your research and look at the actual career opportunities in that field. Another area of research that we're going to finish up with is public policy and politics. I've known a lot of psychologists with graduate degrees, especially at the PhD level, but it's not unheard of at the master's level to be, an operative working in public policy and politics, either as a researcher or as a policy designer in local, countywide, statewide, or federal government roles, and also in think tanks and nonprofits. So psych research has lots of implications in the policy sphere and in the government sphere. While some psychologists may directly run for office, it's much more common for them to be involved in the background. So, if you have a political campaign that's running, I guarantee you that there are psychologists on staff who are working on message crafting, persuasion, attitude assessment, polling, questionnaires, surveys, all of that stuff. There are going to be psychologists involved, either at the master's or the doctoral level. You also may have, at the level of the political party, involvement of psychologists for the same purposes, keeping track of the attitudes, beliefs, and values of the electorate, getting a sense of where attitudes, beliefs, and values are going, how to craft messages so that they are persuasive, and so on. Some of these may be individuals who are actually deeply involved in the marketing kind of side of politics and public policy. So they may be involved in writing briefs, writing reports. They may conduct research so that they can have data on which to base those reports. They may assist lawmakers in building laws and policies and planning strategy. The APA has long been connected to this whole sort of public policy angle, and the argument has long been that psychologists are really an important part of the public policy sphere. A colleague of mine who I went to graduate school with, she has been involved for decades now in the area of public policy as it relates to children and families. And, just one example of the work that she has done is looking at the effectiveness of bullying prevention programs in K through 12 education. And that's an important kind of social issue, right? And it's important that policies that school systems put into place actually work and are worth the money that is invested in them. So there are lots of opportunities in both the government sphere, local, county, state, but also at the federal level for people who want to use their psychology research background and their specific area training to put that into work for the public good. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 5.